I didn't hate walking home. Most of the time, it gave me a chance to think, to escape the daily gauntlet of middle school hallways filled with sidelong glances and muttered insults. The walk was long. 3 miles felt like forever when your backpack was stuffed with textbooks. But it was still better than the school bus. At least walking let me avoid the taunts, the sneers, and the feeling that I was always just one wrong word away from making things worse. The route home was familiar by now. It started at the school gates, wound past a strip of apartments, and then stretched along a busy road lined with sidewalks. The townhouses along the way looked cozy, with flower pots on porches and kids' bikes leaning against fences. The road always buzzed with cars, the constant hum almost comforting in its normalcy. Back in the 90s, no one thought much about kids walking home alone. It was just what we did. But even as I walked, head down and steps steady, I couldn't shake the loneliness that trailed behind me like a shadow. It wasn't just the absence of friends, those I'd given up on long ago. It was the weight of knowing that no one at home really understood. My dad thought walking was a kind of rite of passage, something every kid needed to toughen up. "You'll thank me one day," he'd say, like walking miles in the heat or the cold was going to build character. My mom didn't push back, but I could see the worry in her eyes every time I laced up my sneakers. That day, the sun was starting to dip, casting long shadows across the pavement. I adjusted the straps on my backpack and tried to focus on anything but the ache in my shoulders. The sound of my sneakers scuffing the sidewalk blended with the distant chatter of a radio from one of the townhouses. I passed the apartment block, where the dumpsters always smelled awful, wrinkling my nose and quickening my pace. As I turned the corner onto the busier stretch of road, I felt the first stirrings of unease. It was subtle at first, just the sensation of being watched. I glanced over my shoulder but saw nothing unusual, just the usual stream of cars zipping past. Shaking my head, I tried to laugh it off. "Don't be ridiculous," I muttered under my breath. But then, as I neared the next intersection, I saw it. A car, idling just ahead, pulled over to the curb. For a split second, my heart soared. It was the same color and model as my dad's car, the kind of familiarity that felt like a lifeline after a long day. I squinted at the driver's side window, hoping to catch a glimpse of his face. Maybe he'd finally decided to pick me up for once, to save me from this endless trudge. The thought almost made me smile. But as I got closer, the relief started to curdle into doubt. Something about the way the car sat, just a little too still, felt off. And when the window rolled down and I saw the man inside, my steps faltered. He smiled at me, a wide, practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, and waved me over. "Hey, kid," he called, his voice warm but strange. "Your dad sent me. Hop in. I'll give you a ride." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The car was so much like my dad's, right down to the scratches near the handle. But this man wasn't my dad. And the way he was looking at me made my stomach twist into knots. I hesitated, my feet rooted to the sidewalk as the man leaned closer out of the window. He was smiling, his voice steady and warm. But there was something wrong, something I couldn't name. I glanced again at the car. It really did look just like my dad's, from the color to the scratches near the handle. Even the faint scent of old leather and cigarette smoke drifting out the window felt familiar. But the man, he was a stranger, no matter how much he tried to act like he wasn't. "Your dad got held up at work," he said casually, like he'd practiced the line. "He asked me to swing by and grab you." He gestured to the back seat. "Come on, hop in. He didn't want you walking all this way alone." My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. I didn't move, my legs stiff and uncooperative. "What's his name?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. It felt like the right question, the kind of thing someone who really knew my dad would answer without hesitation. The man blinked, and for a split second, his smile faltered. Then it was back, even wider than before. "You're funny, kid." He chuckled. "Of course I know his name. It's Mark. Now come on, let's get you home." Mark wasn't my dad's name. Every instinct in me screamed to run, but I forced my feet to stay planted. Running didn't feel right. Not yet. My mind raced as I tried to think of what to do. If he wanted to grab me, he could have jumped out of the car by now, but he hadn't. That meant I still had time, a chance to outsmart him. I took a deep breath and nodded, forcing a small, nervous smile. "Okay," I said quietly, stepping toward the car but keeping a safe distance. "Thanks for coming to get me." The man's eyes lit up with something I didn't like. Satisfaction, maybe. He reached over and popped the passenger door open. "Good kid," he said, his voice syrupy sweet. "I'll get you home safe." I climbed into the passenger seat, careful to keep the door cracked just enough to push open if I needed to. The car smelled stronger now, a mix of stale cologne and something metallic that made my stomach churn. I buckled my seatbelt slowly, my hands shaking as I tried to look calm. "I live over by the apartment complex on Spring Hill," I said, naming a place far from my actual home. "You can just drop me off near the entrance." He glanced at me, his smile tightening. "That's a bit out of the way, isn't it?" he asked, his tone still friendly but with an edge that hadn't been there before. I shrugged, keeping my eyes on the road ahead. "It's where my dad told me to meet him," I lied. "He's probably already waiting there." For a long moment, he didn't say anything. The silence pressed down on me, thick and heavy. Then finally, he nodded. "All right," he said, shifting the car into drive. "Spring Hill it is." But the way he said it made my skin crawl, like he didn't believe me at all. The car hummed along the road, the tires making a dull, repetitive thud over the cracks in the pavement. I sat as still as I could, my fingers gripping the edge of the seat while my mind worked in overdrive. The man was quiet now, his earlier friendliness replaced by something colder, sharper. I kept my eyes fixed on the window, pretending to watch the passing houses, but I was really counting turns, tracking every landmark we passed in case I needed to find my way back. As we approached the apartment complex on Spring Hill, I shifted in my seat, trying to look casual even though my heart felt like it was about to burst out of my chest. "You can drop me off right here," I said, pointing toward the entrance. My voice cracked slightly, but I quickly cleared my throat, hoping he didn't notice. He slowed the car, his hands tightening on the wheel. For a moment, I thought he was going to keep driving, but then he pulled over to the curb. "You sure your dad's meeting you here?" he asked, his tone light but probing. I nodded quickly, reaching for the door handle. "Yeah, he's probably already inside. Thanks for the ride." I opened the door and stepped out before he could say anything else, keeping my movements calm and deliberate. The last thing I wanted was to run and give him a reason to follow me. The second my feet hit the sidewalk, I felt a rush of adrenaline. I walked toward the apartment complex, forcing myself not to look back until I was out of sight. Once I was sure I was hidden behind one of the buildings, I crouched down, my breathing ragged and uneven. My hands were shaking so badly I had to press them against my knees to steady them. I stayed there for what felt like hours, listening for the sound of his car or footsteps, anything that might mean he'd followed me. When the silence finally felt safe, I peeked around the corner, His car was gone. Relief hit me so hard I almost collapsed, but I couldn't let my guard down yet. I waited a little longer, just to be sure, before taking off in a sprint toward home. When I burst through the front door, my mom was in the kitchen, her back to me as she stirred something on the stove. "You're home late," she said without turning around. Her voice was calm, normal, but the sound of it broke something in me. The tears came before I could stop them, and when she finally turned to look at me, her expression shifted from confusion to alarm. I told her everything in a rush, the words tumbling over each other as I described the car, the man, and the way he'd tried to trick me. My dad came in halfway through, his brow furrowed as he listened. "Are you sure it wasn't just a misunderstanding?" he asked when I was done, his tone skeptical. "It wasn't a misunderstanding?" I snapped, the fear in my voice making him pause. "He knew things about you, about our family. He wasn't just some guy." My mom's face hardened. "From now on, you're not walking to or from school," she said firmly, her eyes locking on my dad. "You'll drive them every day, no excuses." He opened his mouth to argue, but stopped when he saw the look on her face. "All right," he muttered, nodding reluctantly. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop replaying the day in my head. The man's voice, his fake smile, the way he'd hesitated when I asked my dad's name. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle I never wanted to solve. I knew I'd done everything right, but the fear lingered, a reminder that even in a town like ours, danger could be waiting just around the corner.